Tragically, no, not really. It's been widely, I think it's been a source of concern for many people who thought about the way in which capitalism has developed, globalization developed over the last few years, that there would be large amounts of money slushing around the international system, and what this does is to shed a fairly pitiless light on where some of it's being deployed.
You've written about it. The Prime Minister said he's going to do something about it, and more money is going to be given to HMRC, but it's perfectly obvious that this does not get any smaller with the passing of the years. It gets worse.
Well, of course, it's possible. And what I think has actually happened is that the government's actually done quite a lot about it, which is not actually at the moment getting the credit that's perhaps due. It's passed the Bribery Act, which was the most stringent act of its kind in 2010. It's passed a general anti-avoidance rule for taxation. It's done a lot of work on preventing money laundering.
But you know better than I do. That's not going to stop people evading or avoiding taxes.
No, absolutely not. And the reason for that is because the way in which the financial economy has expanded has dwarfed the effects of nation-states to control it. And therefore, what you need is international agreements and much better enforcement.
Diane Abbot, are we going to get anywhere on this?
Well, not on the basis that David Cameron is still saying he doesn't think it's fair to call these overseas dependencies tax havens. What else are they? But Jesse's talking about this.
But
like
this happened under Labour. Why didn't Labour ever shut down on the 13 sovereign? We have sovereignty over 13 of these tax havens and have done nothing about it.
Labour didn't do. I'm not going to sit here and defend them. But Jesse's talking about this as if it's an abstraction, as if it's victimless activity. One of the consequences of this tax evasion is hundreds of billions of dollars flow out of some of the poorest countries in the world because of the tax evasion, the tax avoidance, and rigged tax treaties. People suffer because it's not just a game.
Yeah, but we know that. What we don't know is why you politicians won't do anything about it.
Because I think in the past, it's not necessarily true of our current leader, people who are in awe of financial services, they're the people that make the money out of this. Why are the big four accountants based where? Panama and British Virgin Islands. Because there's lots of people who want accountants there? No, because those are centres of tax evasion and tax avoidance.
Well, now, what do you make of this? Because obviously the finger's pointing at Mr. Putin tonight, and he's got a great number of colleagues around him that are named in these papers.
Well, I'm surprised that Putin actually came up, because his name is not mentioned in any documents. And to say that he has friends who have offshore accounts, well, doesn't really mean anything concerning Putin. But I must tell you something. I'm probably one of the first Russian businessmen in Britain in the 90s. And our Russian businessmen were finding out about offshore accounts in the end of the 90s, while your lot has been polishing its offshore skills for about 150 years. So to say that the Russians are misusing offshore accounts, when obviously here in Britain and in other Western countries is like part of the deal. Another thing I think that people miss is that if you make your money in the private sector, you can minimize your tax liabilities by having an offshore account. But if you are connected to the budget, to the taxpayers' money, or if you're a criminal, that's criminal. So we have to distinguish who is the criminal and who is not.
So you think that when we scratch the surface of Panama, it'll all be legal?
Well, I don't think it will all be legal, because Panama is a known territory controlled by the CIA very closely. I don't understand who actually opens offshore accounts in Panama. I mean, it's like going to Langley and say, would you keep my money here?
It may be legal, but it's still wrong. And the fundamental problem is a lack of transparency. And Cameron has not done enough to force these tax havens to be transparent about who are the beneficial owners of all this money.
Yanis, I mean, in the old days, we used to look at Greeks and the ship owners and the rest of it who paid no tax, and we used to think Greece was the capital of tax evasion and avoidance. How are you viewing it tonight?
Well, firstly, I'm exceptionally pleased that there are many of those who have enjoyed not so much tax evasion, but tax immunity, who are having sleepless nights. It's a wonderful whiff of transparency, even though it may be short-lived, fills me with joy. But at the same time, fills me with worry that we are focusing too much on a fake sense of surprise. The only thing that's surprising is that we get surprised by this. And we also zoom too much into Panama, the idea of some small island in the Caribbean, when here in the middle of Europe, we have a beggar thy neighbor policy of taxation. States like Ireland, indeed London, are competing unfairly with other parts of Europe We try to steal economic value from one another by offering those with ill-gotten gains the opportunity to launder their money. In London, we have a president of the European Commission who was running a tax haven in the center of Europe. And it is important.
You're talking about Luxembourg.
Of course.
But you see, the problem is London is so big, so important in this whole financial services business, quite a bit of which is very questionable.
It's a very
that
large
it is
tax
too
haven.
too big not to have a relationship with. And so you complain that Europe is sort of fosters all this, but they have no choice.
But I count Britain as part of Europe, don't you?
Well, you see, of course, we're not members of the Euro, and that's the biggest
No, but you're
element.
members of the European Union. And you are as one with us in this race to the bottom, in the beggar thy neighbor policies on tax. It's about time we harmonize taxes, especially if we want to have a single market.
Well, I do think there's something to be said for that. It's also true that competition in tax can be beneficial because it can force governments to offer cost-effective tax terms to companies, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't want a situation in which tax is harmonised at a very high level. You want a degree of competition might be beneficial there. I think
what
really,
you call
I think
cost-effective tax
you've had a couple of pops, Diane. Just hold on for a second. If you just allow us
just finish this point.
Just finish the point before you interrupt. You've had a couple of good pops on the party political side, but the fact of the matter is that when the oligarchs of Russia were starting to repatriate their money in the 1990s, the Labour government did virtually nothing to prevent that from happening. It did not set any norms or control. Peter Mandelson was famously intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. The tax gap got very large. The tax gap got steadily smaller. The amount of tax that is collected, always a hard calculation to make, has got steadily smaller. Does it need to go further? Absolutely. One of the things that's
Okay, well, let's
interesting
just get clear this part of a little point, because you basically made the point I tried to make to you earlier, which is none of the parties that have ever been in power in our lifetime, anyway, has ever done anything about this.
Unfortunately, too many people in the British political establishment have been in awe of financial services. But what Jesse calls cost-effective taxation comes at a price, and the price is paid by ordinary people and people in the global south who are losing all of this money to tax avoidance.
No,
But you see that
there's another point here. A lot of people don't like the way governments spend taxpayers' money. A lot of this money is spent on wars, on vanity projects. It's wasted. So there is a certain protest in all of this, because people are saying, why should I give that money?
Alexander, with respect,
saying-
surely what a lot of people worry about is what did the Russians do in the 1990s when they started shipping these vast quantities of what belonged to Russia out of the country into the city of London,
Let me tell you what happened.
thereby
Let me tell you,
perverting much of
because I
what was going on
witnessed
here.
that. I witnessed that. The problem was that Western bankers and big consultancies came to Russia and said to these oligarchs, you know what, you can hide your money in the West. And they helped them to do that. Banks closed their eyes, Western banks, oh please.
And that's true, Jesse.
I think there's a high degree of truth about that.
I like high degree, but why not just say it's true?
Because it's always a more complex picture than it's described. It's not just about the banks. They were undoubtedly bidding for custom from that part of the world. It's also about the regulation. The regulation was very sloppy and weak at the time, and that's a government responsibility.
But
there's
it
a
isn't
shared,
better now, is it?
there's a shared responsibility.
There's,
Sorry.
You know, the notion that since 2008, 2009, we have really strengthened regulation is rather vacuous. We have done nothing more than cosmetic changes in order to hide the reality that the political system throughout Europe, not just in Britain, this is not a party political point, has utterly and miserably failed to deal with this situation.
And there's nobody you meet that doesn't believe the crisis will dawn again and we'll have another crash. And part of it is about the whole failure to regulate what's coming into London, what's coming into this country, and what's coming into Europe.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I, as you know, have been very prominent in pushing for
You've
the
written about
constraints on crony capitalism, and this is a form of crony capitalism. And it's not just about tax evasion, it's also about money laundering, it's also about corruption.
But you've
all
been
of
on the
which takes
Treasury
place.
Select Committee. What happened there? Did they ever talk about it?
Well, if you noticed what's happened in the last few years, we've had a complete re-regulation of the City of London. The Prime Minister's actually, I think, worked very well and hard to get this up the international agenda. It was the first thing on the agenda of the summit in 2013, tax and transparency. But there is a lack of international consensus, and that does limit the extent to which government of any kind can make a difference.
There's a very important point. The Russians invest money into Britain because it's not in the euro. You must understand that. You are a victim of your own success.
Yes.
If you were in the eurozone, you would see nothing of it. That's the point, and Yanis should think about that.
Last one.
we don't need international cooperation to regulate our own overseas territories and crown dependencies. And that's where Cameron is so wrong. He could have done so much more about transparency.
I've got to thank you all four very warmly indeed for coming in. And, Yanis will be back with us with Jesse Norman later in the programme when we pick over what is wrong with Europe and how can it be solved. Cathy.
Thanks, John. Syrian government forces have seized back control of another strategic town from Islamic State militants, pulverising it in the process. IS fighters have been driven out of Al-Qarayatan after an intense bombardment by Syrian forces backed by Russian airstrikes.